Back off. You've made your point. Step away, now! The shout cuts through the hum of the crowd like a breaking branch. A uniformed officer's face, jaw clenched, finger stabbing the air toward a weathered man standing just beyond the line of orange cones. Heat shimmers off the asphalt between them. The veteran doesn't move. He doesn't raise his voice. He only gestures once, slow and deliberate, toward the far end of the street. There, near the hot dog tent, a group of kids laugh as they chase a drifting red balloon, their sneakers slapping against the pavement dangerously close to a sagging safety barrier. "Sir, I said back off. This area's secured." The officer's tone cracks, more from impatience than authority. The man's badge flashes briefly in the sunlight, polished, untested. Behind him, the smell of fried dough and exhaust mingle with the faint sweetness of melting cotton candy. A child's laughter rings again, fading into the wind. The older man doesn't argue. He doesn't flinch. He simply points again toward the slumped traffic cone sitting crooked over a storm grate. Its edges warped, metal darkened by rust, one hinge hanging loose. His hand trembles slightly as he lowers it, but not from fear, from the memory of knowing what happens next. "Sir, I'm not telling you again." The officer's voice sharpens, drawing a few glances from bystanders. A mother holding her toddler frowns but says nothing. A man with a camera phone starts recording, half smirking, sensing drama. The veteran's gaze doesn't break. His eyes stay fixed beyond them all, locked on the grate, on the spot where the sunlight hits and wavers, the slightest shimmer betraying the hollow beneath. The wind shifts, carrying the dry smell of hot asphalt. Somewhere a flag flutters against its pole. The balloon the children were chasing catches a gust and lifts upward, spinning free, red against blue sky. And in that silent second, as the officer lowers his hand and turns away, the older man whispers, barely audible, "It's going to give." But no one hears him, except one woman in the crowd, a fire department t-shirt faintly visible beneath her jacket, who had been watching everything unfold from across the square. Because she saw what no one else did, the way the old Marine never took his eyes off the danger. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Harold Sutter sat alone beneath the shade of a black gum tree, its leaves curling red at the edges in early fall surrender. The hem of his field jacket touched the concrete bench edge, threadbare where his elbows had rubbed it smooth over the years. His hands, calloused and square-knuckled, rested palm down on his thighs like twin sentries. Beneath the quiet surface of the community safety fair, children shrieking at a dunk tank, fathers sipping lukewarm coffee near patrol cars, a canine handler waving to a baby in a stroller, he watched, not idly, not absent-mindedly, but with the trained attention of someone who had once survived by reading the ground faster than the enemy could lay traps beneath it. His name wasn't announced. No microphone, no parade, just a line inked at the top of a paper, folded tight in his back pocket. Harold Sutter, RSVP, Civic Family Guest. Melissa Sutter, Volunteer Commendation. He hadn't wanted to come. He didn't like small-town crowds, too much noise, too little cover. But Melissa had earned the medal. 35 hours a week helping kids with special needs, and she still called him every Thursday like clockwork. "It would mean the world if you were there, Dad." And so, he came. 74 years behind his shoulders, 3 tours in Southeast Asia packed into a man whose spine still straightened when he heard the pop of air compression brakes. The sounds of the fair rolled over him, but Hal's ears filtered what others didn't notice. The uneven clank of a jackstand being lowered 2 booths away, the hiss of pressure releasing from a poorly sealed propane connection at the corndog tent, the rattling bass of a misplaced sign shifting in wind. But it was the grating shift in tone, the subtle give of pavement beneath the thin edge of a construction cone that caught and held his gaze. At the far edge of the square, just beyond where families wandered near the cotton candy trailer, a lane had been partially cordoned off for resurfacing. Orange mesh fencing sagged between two wooden A-frame signs. Hal's gaze lingered on a slump in the roadbed, a slight dip where black asphalt gave way to a thinner edge of concrete. The cone, tilted and half-folded, barely covered a storm grate whose edges had been worn soft by decades of runoff. There was no tape, no sandbag, just plastic and hope. He rose slowly, his boots scuffing against the curb, hand brushing the bench for leverage. He walked across the street without fanfare, steps even, head turning side to side like checking a perimeter. A volunteer officer in a crisp blue polo intercepted him just beyond the snow cone line. The man smiled at first, then furrowed his brow when Hal pointed behind him. "I think that grate's unsecured. Sloping like that, it could collapse under weight. You might want to—" The officer cut him off with a half-smirk and a raised hand. "Sir, we've got this area covered. Enjoy the fair, all right?" He didn't wait for a response. Turned, already waving at someone behind the grill booth. Hal stood still for a moment, eyes not on the officer but on the child chasing a balloon too close to the fencing. A teenager leaned on a nearby table, holding a soft drink. He chuckled low to his buddy and said something Hal didn't catch. But he heard the tone. Disdainful, casual, like someone mocking a museum exhibit that had wandered too close to the food truck. He returned to the bench but didn't sit. He just stood there a moment longer, arms crossed, one boot slightly forward. The way men stand when there's no perimeter to guard, but still a sense that someone needs to keep watch. Something in the breeze felt off, the way the air moved around the square, tugging at the edges of the banners above the safety tent and lifting the corners of a child's paper plate. The world around Hal carried on in cheerful blindness, unaware that a slow tension had begun tightening, not in noise, but in silence. And still, he watched. Hal moved with the quiet rhythm of a man who had spent decades walking not to be seen. His steps were slow but measured, the toes of his boots always aligning with the seams in the concrete, not from affectation, but from habit. He kept to the outer edge of the fair, his hands loose at his sides, jacket zipped halfway. To most, he looked like any other old man strolling the periphery, maybe trying to kill time before some award ceremony. But beneath the surface of that slow gait, the tension in his shoulders never unwound. Near the edge of the vendor tents, he paused to observe a small cluster of children gathering around a remote-controlled fire truck display. A man in turnout gear waved cheerfully, narrating over a wireless mic as the toy vehicle squirted a short stream of water at a cardboard flame. Parents applauded. Children laughed. Hal didn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the rear corner of the platform where one of the support legs had not been braced properly. The weight of the motor made the plywood flex under the strain, creaking just faintly beneath the excitement. No one else noticed. He counted 5 children within falling distance. At a booth near the main thoroughfare, a uniformed officer gestured animatedly as he explained seatbelt safety to a group of teenagers. Hal caught just one sentence in passing. Something about reaction time in a crisis. The irony brushed over him like dust. He knew what reaction time really looked like when it mattered. And it wasn't a slide deck or a plastic mannequin with blinking lights. It was breath, silence. A half-second of decision made with every muscle, not a theory. He didn't stop walking. A mother crouched near a stroller just ahead, trying to tie her child's shoe. Hal slowed instinctively, watching the child's swaying posture and the distracted position of the mother. He angled away slightly, giving space, but kept them in the corner of his vision. It wasn't suspicion. It was reflex. You scanned everything. Always. He once told Melissa that awareness wasn't paranoia. It was just the tax you paid to survive a life you never talked about. As he passed the safety barricades for the roadwork, Hal's eyes returned to the same hazard from earlier. The sunken drain cover, still crowned by that sagging cone. One corner of the metal grate had slipped further since his last glance. There was now a visible shadow beneath it. If a small foot hit that exact spot, he quickened his pace slightly, angling toward the closest visible authority. a young officer near a folding table handing out junior deputy stickers. He approached calmly, not wanting to cause alarm. "Officer," he said quietly, "there's a hazard near the orange fencing. The ground's unstable. The cone isn't enough." The young man barely looked up, distracted by the child clinging to his belt with admiration. "Sir, it's all been checked out. We've got protocols in place. You're good to keep enjoying the fair." There was no hostility in his tone, only dismissal. The easy kind, the kind that stings more because it assumes the other person is harmless. Hal's brow furrowed, but he didn't push. He just nodded and stepped back. His left hand adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a tic he'd had since Vietnam. "Cover the scar. Keep moving." Two teenagers leaned against a trash barrel behind him, sipping soda and scrolling on their phones. One of them glanced up, just as Hal walked away, and smirked. "Check out Rambo over here," he said under his breath. "Probably looking for landmines in the corn dog line." The other laughed, sharp and mean, but not loud. Just enough to carry. Hal didn't stop. He didn't look back. His pace didn't falter. But inside, something curled a little tighter. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It was the familiar weight of being too early again. Too early to warn. Too early to be heard. Always too early. Until it was too late. The sidewalk curved along the edge of the square. Hal followed it. His eyes moved constantly. Not frantically, but methodically. He tracked crowd movement, wind direction, shifting shadows from the high banners fluttering above. The corner of the construction site was more visible now from this angle. He could see that the gravel base beneath the broken grate had eroded, probably from the recent rain. There was a cavity underneath. A collapse wasn't possible. It was imminent. He tried again, this time with a staff member from the fire department who was adjusting a loudspeaker volume knob. The man was older, maybe mid-50s, with a heavy-set frame and sweat staining the collar of his t-shirt. Hal approached with caution. "Sir, you need to post someone at the corner of the roadwork. The ground's compromised." The man wiped his brow with a towel. "Thanks for the heads up, Gramps, but we did a walkthrough this morning. It's all cleared." He didn't even ask for specifics. Hal took a step back. His fingers tightened slightly at his sides. He could feel his pulse in the bridge of his nose. He scanned the square again. The children were moving closer to that corner now. A balloon artist had set up his stand within 10 feet of the danger zone. Parents were distracted by the show. One child had already hopped the plastic fencing for a better view. It wasn't just being ignored, it was being made invisible. He didn't wear medals. He didn't correct people who got his rank wrong. But in that moment, Hal Sutter felt every decade of distance between the uniform he once wore and the society that barely remembered what it cost. And still, he stood watching. The breeze picked up. The faint metallic scent of hot iron drifted off the nearby work site, mixing with kettle corn and sunscreen. Summer smells, easy smells, masking the slow unease crawling across Hal's shoulders. He stood now closer to the corner, just across from the balloon artist, who was setting up his pump while children crowded around, giggling. The grate, no more than 10 feet from the edge of their laughter, groaned under its own weight as Hal watched the slanted lip dip once more. It wasn't the grate itself that worried him. It was the hollow, the erosion beneath. It was the kind of thing a trained eye could see, but a hurried one would miss entirely. And they had all missed it. Hal stepped across the street again, moving toward the command tent near the center of the square. He didn't rush. He walked like someone who had seen far worse things move much faster. The supervising officer, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with mirror sunglasses and a too-tight uniform, stood beside the main communications cart, radio in hand, gesturing toward the K-9 unit preparing for its next demo. Hal waited respectfully for a pause, then approached. "Sir," Hal said, voice low but clear. "That corner near the orange fencing." The officer cut him off without turning his head. "You're not allowed past this line, sir. Please stay on the civilian side." Hal nodded once. "I'm not trying to breach anything. I'm trying to report a hazard. The ground's compromised by the open drain. The erosion's visible from—" "I said you've made your point. Move along." The officer's voice was sharper now, pitched not for conversation but for the surrounding ears. A few heads turned. A mother carrying a toddler slowed her steps to listen. Hal didn't raise his voice. He pointed calmly toward the barricade. There's going to be a collapse if someone doesn't block it off. The soil's sloughing off underneath. The officer took a step forward, chest puffed. Step away, now. His voice echoed, authoritative and public. This area is secure. You're not helping. Do you understand me? Hal did not move. He did not back down. He let the silence answer. His fingers stayed level, indicating the spot that no one else seemed to care about. The children were closer now. 2 had stepped over the string line without realizing. One of them was skipping. A younger volunteer firefighter stepped up beside the officer, glancing at Hal with uncertainty. Should we at least check it out? He offered. He might have seen. Do not interfere, the officer snapped, cutting the man off mid-sentence. We've already cleared that section. There's nothing to worry about. Then he turned back to Hal. Sir, you are not part of this event. I need you to find somewhere else to be. Don't make me escalate this. Hal exhaled slowly, not in anger, in disappointment. He let his hand drop, adjusted the edge of his cap. His lips pressed together in a line that suggested he'd been told to leave before, more times than anyone could count. But still, he looked once more toward the corner. That slant, that dip, the way the gravel had begun to puddle inward. No wind could move it like that. From across the square, a young boy squealed with delight. His balloon had popped. Hal didn't flinch. Another child pointed toward the balloon man. A line was forming now, parents with phones out, smiling. Hal took a step back. Not out of fear, out of protocol. You give the chain of command every chance to listen. You raise your hand, you warn, and when they don't, you wait, and you watch. He turned, walking slowly back toward the same bench he'd sat on before. His left leg was stiff now, the old shrapnel wound from Cambodia flaring up in the heat. He didn't limp. He just moved slower. As he passed a pair of teenagers, one looked at him and smirked again. Look, Grandpa's doing another perimeter check, he whispered, not quietly. The other snorted, elbowing him. Operation. Paranoia. Hal heard it, as he had always heard it. But he did not stop. His breath was steady. His eyes locked once more on the one spot no one else seemed to care about. The broken grate, the sunken shadow, the absence of a second line of defense. At the far end of the square, a street performer began to play guitar. The song was upbeat, masking the tension under laughter and casual strolls. Children played tag between the food tents. One chased the other, darting closer and closer to the flagged construction zone. The officer who had shouted now leaned on a railing, chatting with a woman in a blazer. He gestured toward Hal, laughing under his breath. She laughed with him. Another chance to dismiss. Another veteran turned nuisance. Hal sat again, back straight, hands on his knees, watching. Not because he wanted to be proven right, but because he had been wrong before. Once. Only once. And he had buried the name that came with that mistake in the soil of a country he barely remembered. And still, despite everything, despite the whispers, the mockery, the heat rising off the asphalt and the heaviness in his chest, Hal Sutter did not flinch. The bench's slats were hot against Hal's back, the sun now riding higher above the square, its heat pressing down like a weighted hand. The plastic cup of water he'd been given earlier sat beside him, warm now, untouched. His elbows rested on his knees, his fingers laced, not in prayer, but in readiness. Across the way, laughter rippled from a face-painting booth. The colors and smiles were honest, joyful even. But Hal's eyes never drifted. They remained fixed on the grate, that loose cone, that slight depression in the concrete, and the knowledge that it was not nothing. It was the start of something bad. A pair of children raced past the edge of the barricade again, their mother calling after them with half-hearted urgency, distracted by her phone. One of the boys clipped the base of the cone with his sneaker. It shifted slightly, wobbling. Hal's fingers flexed once against the fabric of his jeans, a movement so subtle it was invisible to anyone not watching closely. But he was ready, not tense, poised. He watched the wind, not with curiosity but with calculation. The flags on the safety tents fluttered to the southeast. The dust curled near the base of the food truck tires. Hal had spent years reading conditions from nothing more than a rustle, a sound, a shadow. The wind was shifting, slightly, but it would matter. The hollow under that grate wasn't just exposed, it was being dried out, made brittle. It would collapse inward, not outward. That meant the edge would go first, and someone small, a child, wouldn't see it until it was too late. The fair continued without concern. A local radio host was now emceeing from the bandstand, his amplified voice bouncing through the square like static. "Let's hear it for the brave men and women of our local departments. Our protectors." Cheers followed. The same officer who had shouted at Hal earlier stood clapping near the center. No one questioned his awareness. No one asked what he had ignored. The breeze lifted again. Hal's cap moved slightly. He pressed it back into place without thought. His eyes narrowed as a small group of children approached the edge of the barricade, one of them holding a blue balloon shaped like a sword. They gathered near the cone, curious, unsupervised. One of the smaller girls pointed toward the storm grate, leaning forward with childish fascination. Hal's body leaned forward too, unconsciously mirroring the movement. His right hand dropped down beside his leg, fingers brushing the worn denim, the muscles in his forearm twitching like a memory returning. Not the trauma, the instinct, the part of him that had always known when seconds mattered, when hesitation was death. Somewhere behind him, a dog barked twice in rapid succession, a sound most would ignore. Hal turned his head slowly, eyes flicking toward the origin. It was one of the canines, still leashed, barking toward the same direction he was watching. Animals could sense shifts, air pressure, vibrations. The dog knew too, but its handler didn't. Hal returned his gaze to the corner just as a gust of wind lifted the blue balloon. The child holding it let go. It bobbed upward, then darted sideways, caught by the current. The children squealed and chased it, straight toward the cone. A mother called half-heartedly, "Stay inside the tape!" But her voice was casual, not urgent. She hadn't seen. None of them had. Hal stood, slowly, smoothly, like it was a routine, like he was answering a command only he could hear. His shoulders squared, his legs, though stiff, moved with deliberation. He didn't run, he advanced. One girl, the smallest, reached out toward the balloon as it dipped again, landing just shy of the grate. She giggled and darted forward, her little sneakers thumping lightly on the cracked pavement. She crossed the caution tape without resistance. And then, from beneath the cone, a groan, barely audible. But Hal heard it, a dry, creaking moan of shifting steel and stressed concrete, a sound like a memory. His pace quickened, not in panic, in calculation. The girl was 5, maybe 6, lightweight, but not light enough. The cone tipped sideways, and someone else saw Hal's posture shift. Lena Morales had not intended to stay long. Her niece's school had a booth on the far side of the square, and she was only supposed to pick up a packet of volunteer forms. No uniform today, just jeans, sneakers, and the navy blue t-shirt she'd been wearing when she left the station. The logo on the sleeve read, "Fire and Rescue," but few noticed. She was one of dozens milling near the food stands, clutching a paper lemonade cup in one hand and scanning for a familiar face. She was halfway through a sip when the movement caught her eye. A subtle motion across the square, almost out of place in its precision. Her gaze shifted. An old man was rising from a bench, not jerking up like he'd seen something shocking, not sprinting like a civilian panicking, just rising smoothly, with deliberate control. His arms didn't flail, his balance didn't falter. His posture told her everything she needed to know. That wasn't a casual gesture. That was readiness. Her training kicked in before her curiosity could. She followed his line of sight and saw a handful of children at the edge of the barricade. One had already ducked under the tape. A balloon twisted in the breeze, skimming across uneven pavement. Then she noticed the cone, bright orange, slightly tilted, guarding something barely visible. A dark, square void beneath its base. A drain, maybe. Or worse. She took one step forward, then another. The crowd moved around her like background noise. Her body was already adjusting, moving diagonally for a better vantage, when the sound reached her. A strained metallic groan, unmistakable. She froze mid-step. Her jaw tightened. The breeze pushed her hair into her face, and she swept it back with a quick motion. Her eyes locked on the girl, no more than 6, skipping forward after the balloon. The woman nearby, possibly her mother, had looked away. No one was moving fast enough. No one except him. The old man had already crossed the sidewalk. Not running, advancing. It wasn't the speed that drew her attention. It was the form. The way he moved with an economy of motion she hadn't seen in years. It reminded her of her academy instructor, a man who'd survived 2 deployments before coming home to train rookies. He used to say the ones who moved slow in crisis weren't slow at all. They were precise. She reached for her phone instinctively but stopped. There wasn't time. She looked again. His shoulders had squared. His arms were loose but ready. He had passed the first set of food stalls, cutting through the crowd without touching a single person. People moved instinctively out of his path. A cold pressure settled at the base of her spine. A warning, not of fear, of recognition. Whoever he wasn't ordinary. And he wasn't guessing. He had seen this before. A child's giggle rose, and the balloon kissed the edge of the cone. The old man, now no more than 15 feet from the hazard, shifted his weight again, favoring his right leg as if bracing for contact. Her breath caught. Lena began to move faster. She cut left, avoiding the thickest part of the crowd. She still didn't know what would happen, but she knew something was wrong. She could feel it, and so could he. The balloon lifted again, just enough to delay the child's grasp, and that was when the metal shifted for the second time, louder, dry, grinding, like a tired hinge begging for relief. Lena saw the moment it happened, not just the grate, not the cone, but the line, invisible to most, that connected the girl's foot to the failing ground. And she saw the way the man had timed his stride, the angle of his approach, the slight bend in his knees, as if preparing to lower his center of gravity without dropping to the ground. She knew that posture. She had trained for it, but only seen it done well a handful of times. Then it hit her. He wasn't reacting to the child. He had been watching the conditions long before she arrived. He had predicted this. By the time Lena reached the midpoint of the square, people were starting to notice. Heads turned, not in alarm yet, but in mild curiosity. The officer who had shouted earlier still stood with folded arms near the dunk tank, glancing sideways, eyebrows furrowed, but none of them saw what she saw. The old man, whose name she didn't know, whose rank she could only guess, was already in motion. And for the first time in a long while, Lena Morales wasn't the first responder. She was a witness. The girl's sneaker landed on the edge of the grate, the rubber sole compressing against a lip of rusted steel. It was the kind of moment that would have gone unnoticed by everyone but him. The edge gave with a hollow clack, a sudden shift in weight echoing like thunder to the man who'd spent his life in places where seconds counted and footing meant survival. The metal flexed downward, the opening yawning wide like a jaw, and the child, frozen mid-step, didn't even scream. Harold Hal Sutter didn't run. He launched. The movement wasn't frantic. It was formed by decades of training buried deep in muscle memory. His feet hit the pavement hard, his back angled low, arms open in a wide sweep not to catch, but to redirect. He reached her just as her center of balance tilted forward over the mouth of the storm drain. One hand grabbed her shoulder strap, the other her waist, and he twisted, turning his body beneath hers like a pivoting shield. They landed together. Not hard, not uncontrolled, but purposeful. His knees bore the impact, his spine braced for it. The girl clutched the balloon in one hand, her fingers white, her face pale from shock. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Hal had already placed her on her feet, gently, checking her knees, brushing the dust from her side. His hands moved with the precision of a field medic, scanning limbs, checking for shock. And then, only once she was stable, he turned back to the broken grate. It had collapsed inward. The cone had fallen uselessly into the hole. The crowd began to register the sound now. The snap of metal, the gasp from the child's mother, the intake of breath from the people nearest. But Hal didn't look to the crowd. He looked at the space, the dimensions, the cover plate, the warped surface of asphalt leading into it. His mouth pressed into a line. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Lena Morales reached them moments later, her shoes scuffing to a stop as she scanned the child, then the grate, then Hal. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come right away. There was no need to ask if he was the one who saved her. It was in the way the girl looked at him, like he was a stone that hadn't moved even as the ground opened up. The officer from earlier stood paralyzed, eyes wide, face drained of color. He stepped forward but stopped short as he met Lena's glare. His mouth moved, forming words he couldn't quite say. His authority, so confidently wielded before, now hung limp in the face of what everyone had seen with their own eyes. Hal stood, slowly. His knee clicked, but he didn't wince. He straightened his jacket, brushing the dirt from the sleeve with one long stroke. Then he looked to the officer. Not with contempt, not with fury, just a tired patience, the kind only held by men who've seen far worse than bureaucracy. "You left a blind spot," Hal said, his voice low, steady. "And blind spots get people killed." Lena stepped closer. She didn't interrupt. She waited. The words weren't for her. "I tried to tell you," Hal continued, now glancing back at the broken barricade. "Not once, twice. You told me to back off." The officer swallowed hard. He didn't answer. A hush fell over the square. Conversations died off. Balloons stopped bobbing. Music from the speakers crackled and faded into silence. All eyes were now on the man who had knelt, reached, turned, and caught a falling life. And for the first time all morning, no one was questioning why he had spoken up. Hal looked at the little girl, now in her mother's arms, and nodded once. He said nothing to her, just gave the kind of expression that reassured in silence. Then he turned to Lena, who met his eyes without flinching. "I need someone to shut that down completely," he said, pointing to the failed grate, "and check the rest of the perimeter." Lena didn't pause. She tapped the radio at her hip, issuing a direct call to fire operations. Her tone was sharp, not panicked, but decisive. "Lock down the south side of the square. We've got a failed cover and unsecured access. Send rope and signage now." The police officer stepped back, as if pushed by invisible weight. His arms dropped from his chest. The crowd slowly began to understand. This wasn't just an old man with a concern. This was a man trained to act while others froze. As emergency tape began to appear, as barricades were moved and cones multiplied, Hal stood again at the edge of the chaos, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a constant. The square, for all its noise and movement, had stilled around him, and somewhere deep in the minds of every onlooker, one unspoken question pulsed like a heartbeat. Who was he really? Lena knelt beside the open storm grate, hand resting on the child's shoulder, as she carefully examined the twisted iron lip and the torn edge of the cone, now lying uselessly inside the opening. The child clutched her balloon still, eyes wide, but no longer crying. Hal had already knelt again, not to check the child this time, but the ground. He ran a calloused hand over the asphalt near the edge, pressing lightly. It gave, just slightly, and he traced the faint dip in the surface like reading the lines of an old wound. He didn't speak, but Lena followed his gesture, seeing now what he'd seen long before anyone else had even noticed it was there. Hal's hands didn't tremble. They were steady, precise, with a quiet strength that made even his silence feel instructional. He examined the tilt of the cone. The ripple in the blacktop from decades of frost and thaw. The pattern of foot traffic that must have shifted it out of place. Every movement spoke not just of instinct, but of repetition. Of a man who'd mapped dangerous paths before others even knew where they were headed. Lena didn't interrupt him. She simply watched the way his eyes moved. Not fast, not scanning. Measuring, evaluating, calculating. Like the ground was a battlefield, and he was already reading the terrain. Behind them, the crowd had quieted to a respectful hush, the air thick with a kind of unspoken reverence. Even the music from the festival speakers had been shut off, the echo of the last beat hanging in the still air like a held breath. The police officer who had dismissed Hal earlier stood near the food truck line now, his shoulders squared but hands clenched behind his back. He wasn't hiding. He was learning, perhaps for the first time, what real authority looked like when it didn't demand attention, but earned it. Lena rose from her crouch slowly, brushing her knees. She didn't say, "Thank you." Not yet. That would come later. Instead, she mirrored Hal's posture, hands behind her back, feet shoulder-width apart, eyes on the damage. In her training, they had always said leadership wasn't about who spoke loudest, but about who moved first when it counted. And this man, this weathered Marine with no title, no badge, no clipboard, had moved when no one else had. Hal finally turned toward her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, not as strangers, not as civilians and officers, but as something else. There was a silence that passed between them, not awkward, but weighted. As though within it lived years, neither had spoken aloud. Lena's jaw tensed, and she gave a short nod. Not of deference, not of obligation. A soldier's nod. The kind that says, "I see it, I know it, and I would have followed you too." He nodded back, just once, barely perceptible. A moment later, the chief of police pushed through the gathered crowd, his pressed blues standing out against the families still lingering in pockets. He stopped short when he saw Hal and Lena standing side by side. His eyes flicked between them, taking in the collapsed cone, the compromised grate, and the child now being walked back to her mother. His expression shifted slowly, from confusion to realization to something near shame. Lena didn't break eye contact with Hal as she spoke to the chief. "This man just prevented a fatality, and he warned your officer before it happened." The chief looked to his officer. The younger man's eyes dropped. He didn't defend himself. He couldn't. Hal stepped forward, not confrontational, but clear. "I don't need an apology. Just do the work. Check every single one of these barricades. Twice. Have someone crawl under the tents and feel the earth. You'll find another one ready to give before the week's out." The chief nodded slowly, swallowing the lump of ego caught in his throat. "We'll do it." Lena turned to Hal once more, her voice lowered. "You weren't just watching. You were guarding." Hal looked out over the square, over the children with painted cheeks and the parents trying not to stare, over the slowly returning music and the volunteers resetting chairs. That's what we were trained to do. Stay ahead of the danger, even if no one sees it coming. And in that pause, in that quiet, there was a shared understanding, born not from shared stories, but from shared instincts. It didn't need medals. It didn't need fanfare. It was the kind of moment that stitched two lives together without a single word more. Hal didn't linger in it. He turned, walking slowly back toward the same bench he'd been seated on earlier that morning. The seat still held the faint imprint of where he'd sat for over an hour, watching a world that had nearly looked away from something vital. But now, it wasn't just him. Others were watching too. The bench creaked softly beneath him as Hal eased himself back down, the stiffness settling again into his hips like it always did after a fast movement. His knees ached, though he didn't show it, and one hand rested palm down on the cool slats beside him, as if steadying something internal. A soft breeze lifted the edge of his field jacket. He didn't adjust it. He let the air move freely, his eyes staying locked on the cone that now lay tipped beside the open grate. The same cone he'd seen hours ago and tried to warn them about. Lena approached slowly, not wanting to intrude, but knowing she had to ask. In her hand, she held a plastic water bottle she hadn't opened, condensation slipping between her fingers. She offered it silently. Hal took it, nodded once, then twisted the cap with a patient click. He took a sip, just enough to coat his throat, then set it between his boots. She sat down beside him, not too close, not too far, her arms resting on her thighs, her posture still straight, despite the emotional weight she was now carrying. "I keep thinking about that catch," she said after a while. "You didn't just see it, you predicted it." Hal didn't answer immediately. His eyes were on a young family walking in the distance, the child now safe, tucked between her parents, her balloon trailing behind like a memory. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low. "I've seen what it looks like, right before something gives way." She waited. He didn't elaborate. So she asked softly, "Was that from overseas? From the war?" Still, he hesitated. Then, without turning to look at her, he said, "Firebase Delaney, Vietnam, 1972. The words dropped heavy between them. Lena froze, not out of shock, but recognition. "My dad was there," she whispered. He never talked much about it, but he mentioned a scout once, a Marine who spotted the tunnel collapse before the north side of the hill went. Said that's the only reason his lieutenant lived. Called him a ghost. Said he moved like he'd already seen what was coming. Hal's head lowered slightly, but not in pride. He rubbed the side of his jaw with one thumb, the stubble scraping against hardened skin. "I wasn't fast enough to get them all out. We saved 8, lost 3. His voice didn't waver, but the memory pressed visibly into his shoulders. The walls moved like breath. Earth went soft and just folded in on itself. All you could do was listen and run. Lena stared at the street in front of them. For a long time, neither spoke. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded slip of weathered paper. Not large, not ornate. He opened it carefully and handed it to her. It was a list, written in tight block letters. Names, locations, notes in the margins about soil type, weather conditions, structural stresses, but none of them recent. She read one aloud. Route 9, clay saturation, night patrol, crack opened like thunder. "That was the last one," he said. "We were just walking. The man behind me disappeared in a blink. Ground swallowed him whole." She folded it back and returned it without a word. "That's why I watch now," he continued. "Every step, every slope, every cone that's not angled right. You live through one of those days. You never assume the ground's as solid as it looks." Lena leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees again, absorbing the truth he carried. "Why didn't you ever talk about it?" she asked. Hal looked down at his hands, scarred, strong, veined with time. He turned them over once. "Because the ones who didn't come home don't get to tell their stories. And the ones who did, we're just supposed to live like we don't carry them." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. From across the street, the officer who dismissed him earlier stood near the safety tent, talking to another volunteer. His posture had changed, less rigid, more deliberate. He kept glancing over at the bench where Hal sat. Eventually, he started walking their way, slow and unsure. Hal noticed but said nothing. When the officer reached them, he didn't speak right away. Just stood, hands folded in front of him. "I owe you more than an apology," he said at last, voice rough. "I saw you as a nuisance. Didn't even stop to listen." Hal met his gaze. "You weren't the first. You won't be the last." The officer nodded, shoulders lowering with the weight of humility. "I read your name in the incident report," he added. "Harold Sutter. My uncle mentioned you once, back when I was in the academy. Said you were a legend. Said you didn't need stripes to command a field." Hal's brow furrowed faintly. "That doesn't matter. The girl's alive. That's all that does." "But it does matter," the officer replied, "because we're trained to secure threats, and you're still out here doing it." The breeze shifted again. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Hal looked up, eyes following the sound, then down at the repaired grate, now circled in fresh caution tape and properly reinforced. Maybe this time they would remember. The heat of late afternoon had softened into a thick golden light, casting long shadows across the courthouse square. The festival had not resumed its former rhythm. Not fully. The booths still stood, the flags still fluttered, but everything had taken on a quieter tone. There was a shift, almost imperceptible, like the air had been stirred by something deeper than a gust of wind. People were no longer laughing over loudspeakers or huddled around games. They stood differently, watched differently, especially those who had seen what happened. Hal remained seated, his posture unchanged, but something in his presence now held gravity. Not weighty like authority, but anchored, like a fixed star in the sky everyone suddenly realized had been there the whole time. Lena still sat beside him, arms folded loosely, but alert. Her role had shifted too. No longer just the off-duty firefighter. She had become witness, keeper of the moment. Across the square, the police chief finally stepped into view. Older than the patrolman from earlier, his uniform trim, brass polished, cap tucked under one arm. His expression was unreadable as he approached. He stopped a few feet from Hal and gave a slight incline of his head. He didn't salute. He didn't grandstand. He simply said, "Mr. Sutter." Hal raised his eyes, gave a single nod. "Chief." The chief turned slightly, scanning the still-watching crowd. He cleared his throat, not for volume, but to draw attention. Just enough. "This morning," he began, "we made a mistake." There were murmurs in the crowd, none loud. Just the rustle of people turning, of children being hushed by their parents. "We ignored a warning. We dismissed it. Not because it lacked merit, but because we failed to recognize the man giving it." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "That won't happen again." He turned back to Hal. "From today forward, all law enforcement officers working public safety events in this town will be briefed to respect verified observations made by retired military veterans, especially those with operational experience in reconnaissance or structural risk." He paused, eyes level. "We're calling it the Sutter Protocol." A flicker passed across Hal's face. Not pride, not discomfort, but resistance. He exhaled slowly, like measuring words before they arrived. "I didn't do this for a name." The chief nodded. "We know. That's exactly why it needs yours." Beside him, Lena stepped forward. Her voice was softer, but firm. "He's not asking for a banner. He's asking for diligence, for humility." She turned to the chief, then the watching officers, then the families scattered across the green. "He gave you a second chance to listen. Someone else might not have. Let's not waste it." The mayor, who had arrived during the exchange and stood quietly at the edge of the scene, now made his presence known with a short, respectful step forward. He held a sheet of paper, not a certificate, not an award, just a small draft resolution. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't offer it to Hal. He handed it to the chief. "Have it posted at every municipal training site." Then, he looked to Hal directly. "You gave us more than a rescue today. You gave us a recalibration." Hal gave no response. His eyes were already elsewhere, watching a young officer inspect another cone at the far end of the square, pressing his boot lightly to test the pavement edge. It held. He moved on to the next. The crowd didn't cheer. No one clapped. But slowly, unmistakably, they stood. Folding chairs were set down. Phones slipped back into pockets. Children turned quiet. It wasn't ceremony. It was awareness. The kind that doesn't ask to be seen, but once seen, can't be ignored. Hal's gaze swept the square once more. Not for acknowledgement, for confirmation. And what he saw wasn't applause, but change. Not fanfare, but readiness. He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, same posture as earlier. The place hadn't changed, but the people had. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself a moment to rest. A week later, the courthouse square no longer bore the noise of sirens or the rush of panicked feet. The fair tents had been taken down. The balloons and bunting were long gone. In their place stood quiet benches under the shade of oak trees, their branches now crisp with early autumn. The air smelled faintly of dry leaves and sun-warmed concrete. The only sounds were the distant tapping of a flagpole cord, the murmuring wind, and the occasional passing car rolling slow down Main Street. It was a peaceful Saturday, as most should be. Hal Sutter sat exactly where he had before. Same bench, same posture. His hands rested on his thighs, not clasped, not idle, just patient. He wore the same worn field jacket, though today it was zipped higher against the morning chill. The patch on his chest had faded a bit more. His boots were freshly brushed, though not polished. There was no ceremony in his presence, just steadiness. Across from him, the storm grate that had nearly swallowed a child was no longer a hazard. The entire curb had been re-cemented, the slope corrected. A new steel cover had been drilled in and painted with a reflective edge. A short black post stood beside it now. Not a monument, not even a plaque, just a sign, small and unassuming. It read, "If you see something, say it. Then check again." There was no mention of Hal's name, but his words were there, quietly embedded in policy and practice, a new kind of legacy. Hal watched as a young cadet, no more than 20, walked the edge of the square. He wore a gray training uniform, clipboard in hand, expression focused but nervous. He paused near the repaired drain, reading the sign carefully. Then he turned, hesitantly at first, and walked toward the bench. "Sir?" the cadet said, not loud, not presumptive, just enough to be heard. Hal didn't look up right away. When he did, his eyes scanned the boy, not for rank or presentation, but for bearing, the way he stood, the way he held that clipboard just a little too tight. He was green, but he'd come. The cadet nodded toward the concrete. "I'm working on the municipal safety review rotation. They said I could ask you something." Hal raised one brow just slightly. The cadet swallowed and pointed awkwardly toward the grate. "I was wondering, would you mind going over the signs again? Of ground stress? You know, the things most people miss." There was no smile, just the barest shift of Hal's mouth. Not amusement, not pleasure, but recognition. He gestured slowly to the empty space on the bench beside him. The cadet sat. Hal leaned forward, his voice barely above the wind. "You see the pavement line? The micro-fracture by the far bolt?" The cadet leaned in. "Yes, sir." Hal tapped his own knee. "Watch for water pooling at the edges when it hasn't rained. That seepage means pressure's pushing up from underneath." The boy nodded, writing carefully. Another pair of boots approached, then another. Within minutes, 3 more junior officers, a volunteer paramedic, and a safety planner in a city vest had gathered quietly, each within earshot. None interrupted, none recorded. They listened, and Hal kept talking. He didn't reference war. He didn't speak of medals or history, just angles. Pressure points, the way concrete shifts before it breaks, the difference between settled silence and danger disguised as calm. The square was no longer his to protect, but it had become something else. A quiet classroom, a place where respect did not arrive with applause, but with note-taking and steady ears. The morning light shifted, and a breeze stirred the corner of the folded paper still tucked into Hal's jacket pocket, the one with the list of repairs for the house back home. He'd crossed off a few things recently, but he hadn't thrown it away. At the far end of the sidewalk, Lena Morales passed by, coffee in hand. She didn't stop him, just tipped her head in a silent hello, and he returned the gesture without breaking his sentence. Another tradition had begun, and for once, it didn't need ceremony, only continuity. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.